They say a mother's love is the one thing in this world a child can always count on. But for Ruth Callahan, her mother's hands were never open to hold her. They were only ever raised. The town of Iron Ridge, Montana, 1883, had a way of grinding people down until they fit the shape the land wanted them to be, small, hunched, and silent. Ruth Callahan had never fit that shape. At 22, she stood a full head taller than any woman in the county, with shoulders built by years of hauling 100-pound flour sacks across the general store floor, while men with half her strength stood aside and laughed. They called her the ox. They called her the mule. They called her things a decent person wouldn't repeat in daylight. But none of them cut like her mother. Dolores Callahan had a tongue sharper than a skinning knife, and she had spent 2 decades using it on the one person who could never walk away, her own daughter. Too big, too clumsy, too much. Ruth had heard it so many times the words had worn grooves into her bones. She had learned not to cry. She had learned not to answer back. What she had not learned, what no one in Iron Ridge had bothered to teach her, was that her size was not a shame to be managed. It was a weapon waiting for the right war. And the man who would hand her that war descended from the peaks on a Tuesday, a worn axe at his hip and gold in his coat, looking at Ruth Callahan the way no one ever had, like she was exactly what he needed.
He came on a Tuesday. But Ruth's Tuesday had started the same way every Tuesday did, before the sun had fully committed to rising, with 100 pounds of milled flour on her back, and her mother's voice already sharpened and ready. "Pick your feet up, girl. You walk like a cart horse that's given up." Dolores Callahan stood at the edge of the general store's loading dock, arms folded across her chest, watching her daughter work with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had mistaken cruelty for authority. She hadn't lifted a sack herself in 15 years. Her back, she always said, wasn't built for it. Ruth's back, apparently, was built for nothing else. The flour sacks came off the supply wagon in pairs, 2 at a time for most of the store boys, who were younger and louder and earned actual wages. Ruth moved them alone. She had long since stopped waiting to be offered help. The offer never came, and the waiting only made the weight feel heavier. She hauled, she stacked, she kept her eyes on the floor. "You're dragging the bottom corner again," Dolores said from her position of perfect stillness. "You'll split the seam, and then I suppose I'll have to answer for that too." "It won't split. Don't talk back to me." She hadn't been talking back. She'd been stating a fact. But Ruth had learned years ago that the distinction didn't matter to her mother. What mattered to Dolores was the architecture of the thing, the way a correction could be followed by a dismissal, followed by a sigh that communicated an exhaustion so deep and personal that Ruth herself was the cause of it. It was a structure her mother had perfected the way some women perfected pie crust. A pair of miners leaning against the post outside laughed at something, and Ruth felt the specific, practiced stillness she had built around herself settle into place like armor. She didn't look up. She knew what she would see. She had seen it enough times that it had stopped being a wound and become something closer to weather, unpleasant, predictable, and not worth arguing with. "Lord, she's a big one of them said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Callahan's girl, works like a mule, eats like one too, I'd wager." Dolores didn't defend her. She adjusted the collar of her coat.
Ruth set the last sack down, straightened to her full height, which was, as it had always been, considerable, and rolled her shoulders back. Her hands were chalked white with flour dust. Her boots were worn through at the left heel. She had been awake for 4 hours already, and the sun was barely clearing the ridge. "The Henderson order still needs pulling," Dolores said, already turning toward the door. "And try not to knock anything over this time. You've got no business moving through a room like you own the space." Ruth watched her mother disappear inside. She stood there for a moment in the cold morning air, flour on her hands and the miners' laughter still hanging at the edge of her hearing, and she did what she always did. She breathed. She squared herself. She went back to work. There was no bitterness left in it by now, or rather, the bitterness had been there so long it had become structural, load-bearing, the thing that kept her upright when softer emotions would have buckled her. She did not cry. She had not cried in years. Crying required the belief that someone nearby might be moved by it, and Ruth had no evidence to support that belief. She pulled the Henderson order. She stacked the remaining crates. She swept the flour dust off the dock with a broom that was 2 inches too short for her height, and had been for as long as she could remember. She did not notice the man watching her from across the road. Not yet. But he had already noticed her. The miner's name was Cord Pruitt, and he had the particular confidence of a man who had never once been made to feel small. He was broad across the chest, loud in the way that men are loud when they've had an audience long enough to forget what silence feels like. And he had been watching Ruth work for the better part of 20 minutes with the expression of someone who had spotted an easy target and was simply waiting for the right moment to take the shot. The moment came when Ruth's broom caught the edge of a loose board and sent a small cloud of flour dust drifting toward the group of men still loitering by the post. "Watch yourself," Pruitt said, waving a hand in front of his face with theatrical offense. His companion shifted into the loose, anticipatory arrangement of men who sensed entertainment coming. Ruth looked at him. "Board's loose. I'll let Mr. Garfield know." "You'll let him know." Pruitt repeated it back to her in the flat, mimicking tone of a man who found other people's straightforwardness funny. He pushed off the post and took a few steps toward the dock, thumbs hooked in his belt. "You know what your problem is, girl?" Ruth kept her eyes on him and said nothing. "You move around this town like you've got the same right to the space as everybody else." He gestured at her, a slow, sweeping gesture that took in all of her, top to bottom, with the deliberate thoroughness of an insult that wanted to make sure it landed. "Something that size ought to have the decency to stay out of the way." The men behind him laughed. It was the kind of laughter that needed permission to exist, and Pruitt had just granted it. Ruth set the broom against the wall. She stepped down off the dock, and she walked toward Cord Pruitt with the slow, unhurried movement of someone who had made a decision and was no longer in any particular rush. She stopped 2 feet from him. At her full height, she was nearly level with his eyes, and something in his expression flickered, not quite fear, but the shadow of it, the first suggestion that the joke might have legs he hadn't accounted for. She looked at him the way you look at weather, steady, assessing, utterly unmoved. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply stood there in the flour-dusted morning light and let the silence do the work, and the silence was considerable. Pruitt's blim held for a moment, then shifted into something less certain. He glanced back at his companions, who had gone quieter than he'd expected. He laughed, but it was shorter this time, and it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Crazy as she is big," he muttered, and turned away. He walked back to his companions with the deliberate casualness of a man pretending he'd chosen to leave. Ruth watched him go. Then she turned, picked up her broom, and went back to sweeping. Across the road, half shadowed by the gap between the farrier shop and the dry goods store, Declan Wade had not moved. He'd ridden into Iron Ridge that morning with one purpose and a list of 3 names, none of which had anything to do with the woman on the logging dock. He'd stopped because something had made him stop, some quality in the way she moved, the economy of it, the absence of performance. Most people, when they were being watched, adjusted themselves. They shrank, or they puffed up, or they played to whatever audience they imagined. The woman with the broom had done none of those things. She'd faced down a man with a mean mouth and twice the social standing, and she'd done it without a word, without a flinch, with nothing but the particular stillness of someone who had long ago stopped needing approval to know their own worth.
Declan Wade had spent 15 years in the mountains learning to read what a person was made of beneath the surface. He read her in about 40 seconds. He stayed where he was, and he thought about the winter coming, and the cabin, and the man hunting him through 3 territories who would not stop until one of them was dead. Then he thought about her again.
He found the Callahan shack at the edge of town, where the road stopped pretending would be a road and became something more honest. 2 ruts in the dirt, leading to a structure that had been built without much hope and had declined steadily from there. Declan knocked once. He was not a man who knocked twice. Dolores Callahan opened the door with the expression of someone who had been interrupted doing something important, though the smell of cold grease and stale air suggested otherwise. She looked him over the way a merchant looks over an unfamiliar currency, trying to determine the value before committing to a transaction. "Mrs. Callahan?" Declan said. "I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "You don't." He was not a man who filled silence with unnecessary words, and the silence that followed was long enough that Dolores, who could not tolerate a vacuum, filled it herself. "Well, what do you want? I'm not running a boarding house." "I'm not looking for a room." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a leather pouch. He held it out, not in offering yet, just in visibility, letting her see the weight of it, the way it sat in his palm with the particular heaviness that only one thing produces. "I want to talk to you about your daughter." Dolores's eyes went to the pouch. They stayed there. "Ruth, if that's her name." Something shifted in Dolores Callahan's face then. Not warmth, nothing so generous as that, but a kind of calculation that moved behind her eyes like weather changing over flat land. She opened the door wider. "You'd better come in." The inside of the shack confirmed everything the outside had suggested. 2 chairs, a table, a stove that was losing an argument with the cold. Ruth was not there. Declan noted that without comment and sat where he was gestured to sit. Dolores remained standing, which was the move of a woman who decided this was a negotiation and intended to conduct it on her terms. "What's your interest in my daughter?" "I need someone capable for the winter. My place is at altitude. It's hard work and there's no comfort in it. I've watched her this morning. She's strong, she doesn't complain, and she doesn't rattle when she's pushed." He paused. "Those are qualities I can use." Dolores looked at the pouch again. Use her for what, exactly? Running a homestead, hauling, fortifying against weather and whatever else the mountain sends. He set the pouch on the table between them. "I'm not interested in anything that needs explaining to a preacher." It was a plain statement, without sentiment in either direction, and Dolores received it the same way. She reached out and touched the pouch with 2 fingers. The weight of it did what gold always does to people who have lived without it. It rearranged their priorities. "She's difficult, stubborn, doesn't know her place." "Good," Declan said. That wasn't the response Dolores had expected. She looked at him properly for the first time, taking in the scar along his jaw, the worn steadiness of a man who would survive things by choice rather than luck. "She'll slow you down on a mountain trail." "She won't." Dolores picked up the pouch and turned it over in her hands. The calculation in her eyes had finished running and arrived at its conclusion with the speed of a woman who had already decided and was simply observing the formalities. "When would you take her?" "Tomorrow, before light. And she doesn't come back." It was not a question. It was the one condition Dolores Callahan attached to the sale of her daughter, and she delivered it with the flat, unbothered tone of someone setting down a burden they had grown tired of carrying. Declan looked at her for a long moment. He thought about what kind of woman produces that sentence without flinching, and he thought about the girl on the loading dock who had learned her stillness somewhere, and he understood in that moment exactly where she had learned it. "She doesn't come back," he said. He stood, buttoned his coat, and walked out into the cold without another word, leaving Dolores Callahan alone with her gold and her quiet and the particular emptiness of a woman who had just gotten exactly what she wanted.
Ruth was awake before he knocked.
She had always been a light sleeper, a survival habit developed young for a house where the mood could change faster than the weather and it was better to hear things coming. She had not been told much. The night before, Dolores had set the terms with the efficiency of someone closing a ledger. A man had come, he had paid. Ruth would leave in the morning with what she could carry, which Dolores made clear was not to include anything of value. Ruth had stood in the doorway of her small room and looked at the sum total of her possessions and found that the instruction required very little interpretation. She took her heaviest dress, her work boots, a folding knife her father had left behind, and the knowledge that she was not going to cry about any of it. Declan was standing outside when she opened the door, 2 horses breathing steam into the dark air behind him. He looked at what she was carrying, a single canvas roll, modest and practical, and he handed her a pack without a word. It was already loaded. She took it, felt the weight settle across her shoulders, and adjusted the straps with the automatic competence of someone accustomed to bearing things. He mounted his horse. He did not offer to help her mount hers. She didn't need it. They rode out of Iron Ridge in the last hour of darkness, and no one came to the door of the Callahan shack to watch them go. The trail into the peaks began gently enough, rising through stands of pine that smelled of cold sap and frozen earth, the horses moving at a pace that felt almost manageable. Then the trail narrowed, steepened, and shed any remaining pretense of hospitality. The horses were left at a way station 2 hours into the climb, a rough post in a trough, maintained by no one in particular for anyone who needed it. From here, Declan told her, they walked. He handed her a second pack from the saddle. She put it on over the first, redistributed the weight across her frame, and followed him up. He set a pace that was not cruel but was not kind either. It was simply the pace of a man who knew the mountain and respected it enough to not waste daylight. He did not look back to check on her. He did not slow at the switchbacks or pause at the exposed ridgelines where the wind came off the higher elevations with a sharpness that made her eyes water and her jaw ache from clenching. Ruth kept up. Not easily. Her lungs burned with the altitude, and her thighs screamed on the steeper pitches, and twice she stumbled on loose shale and caught herself with her hands, scraping her palms raw on the rock. She did not call out. She got up, and she kept moving. An hour into the climb, she stopped thinking about her mother's voice. 2 hours in, she stopped thinking about Iron Ridge entirely. The mountain had a way of narrowing the world down to what was immediately necessary, the next foothold, the next breath, the position of Declan's pack 15 yards ahead of her through the trees. Everything else fell away, like weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. It was, she would think later, the first time in years that her mind had been quiet. Declan stopped once at a natural shelf of rock that looked out over the valley below. He drank from a canteen and handed it to her without looking at her. She drank and handed it back. They stood for 30 seconds looking at the distance they'd covered, Iron Ridge already small and brown and irrelevant in the valley floor, and then he turned and started climbing again. She followed. By the time the trees thinned and the cabin came into view against the gray afternoon sky, rough-hewn and dark and barely distinguishable from the rock it sat against, Ruth Callahan's legs were trembling and her hands were bleeding, and she had not asked him to slow down once. Declan stopped at the door, and for the first time since Iron Ridge, he looked back at her. He said nothing, but he waited for her to reach him before he opened it. The inside of the cabin was not what she had expected, though she would have struggled to say precisely what she had expected. Something finished, perhaps. Something that suggested the person living in it had made a decision about permanence. What she found instead was a structure and an ongoing argument with itself. The main room was large enough, a good square footage of rough-hewn log walls and a plank floor that had been laid with competence, if not care. There was a table, solid and scarred, 2 chairs that didn't match, a sleeping shelf built into the far wall with a single wool blanket folded at its foot with military precision, which was the only thing in the room that appeared to have been deliberately arranged. Everything else existed in a state of aggressive disorder that suggested not laziness, but simply a man who had been too busy surviving to consider the difference between stored and strewn.
Rope coils hung from the ceiling pegs next to dried meat that had been tied in bundles of varying size and age. Crates were stacked without system along the east wall, some open, some nailed shut, their contents unknowable. The stove squatted in the corner like a sullen animal, cold and ash-choked, surrounded by a scatter of tools that belonged to it and tools that did not. A rifle leaned against the wall beside the door. Another was visible through the open frame of a second room she could not yet see into fully. Ruth stood in the middle of it and took it in with the slow, methodical attention of someone making an inventory. Declan set his pack down and moved to the far wall where a rough map was pinned at eye level. He studied it with his back to her. "Stove needs clearing before it'll light," he said. "Ash drawer's been full since September. Food stores are in the crates on the left. What's there is what there is until the first thaw. Water's from the stream 30 yards east, but the top will have frozen overnight, so you'll need the hand axe." He paused, consulting something on the map. "Axe is somewhere near the stove." Ruth located it under a coil of rope and a tin cup. "I see it." "Good." He pulled on a second coat from a peg by the door. "I'll be back before dark." He opened the door and walked out into the gray afternoon and closed it behind him with the same economy of motion he applied to everything, which was to say, completely and without drama. Ruth stood alone in the cold, disordered room and listened to the sound of the wind working at the walls, and she waited for the feeling of abandonment to arrive. It didn't. What arrived instead was something she needed a moment to identify because it was unfamiliar enough to require examination. It felt, she decided, like space, like a problem that was hers to solve with no one standing over her shoulder to tell her she was solving it wrong. She took off her outer coat and rolled up her sleeves. She found the ash drawer and cleared it, carrying the load outside in a tin bucket and dumping it downwind. She located the kindling, split and stacked behind the left crate wall, more organized than anything else in the room, which told her something about what Declan considered essential. She laid the fire with the particular efficiency of someone who'd built hundreds of them under worse conditions, and when she touched the match to it, the stove accepted it without argument. While the room began its slow climb toward warmth, she turned to the crates. She opened each one, assessed the contents, and began arranging them according to a logic that was her own: frequency of use, weight, spoilage risk. She found 2 crates of ammunition behind a sack of oats and noted their position carefully before restacking everything in front of them. By the time the light through the single window had shifted to the flat gold of late afternoon, the stove was hot, the stores were cataloged, and the floor around the east wall had been cleared of everything that had no business being on a floor. She was examining the structural gap in the window frame, wide enough to let in wind and, she noted, a sight line, when she heard his boots on the steps outside. Declan opened the door and stopped. He looked at the room. He looked at her. His expression didn't change exactly, but something in it settled, the way a man looks when a calculation he'd made privately turns out to be correct. He said nothing. He hung up his coat, sat down at the table, and waited for her to tell him what she'd found.
She told him about the window first, not because it was the most pressing of what she'd found, but because the way he received information told her more about the situation than the information itself. She had learned that habit young, watching her mother's face when news arrived, reading the shape of what was coming before it came. Declan listened without interrupting. When she described the gap in the frame, the angle of the sight line it created, the way a man positioned northeast of the cabin would have a clean view of the stove and anyone standing near it, something behind his eyes sharpened in a way that confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. "You sealed it?" he said. "Packed it with pitch cloth for now. It needs proper timber and a wedge joint to hold through the winter. I can do it tomorrow if you tell me where the lumber is." He looked at her for a moment. "South side of the woodpile. There's a stack of cut pine under the tarp." She nodded and filed it.
Then she told him the rest, the ammunition she'd found behind the oats, the second cache she'd located under the sleeping shelf wrapped in oilskin, the way the cabin's single door opened outward, which was good for egress under pressure, but meant the hinges were exposed to weather and, more relevantly, to tools. She told him she'd counted 4 approach lines to the cabin from the tree line, that 2 of them offered significant cover for anyone moving toward the structure, and that the east-facing window, the one that worked, had a field of view that covered exactly none of those lines. By the time she finished, Declan was leaning forward with his forearms on the table and his hands loosely clasped, watching him with the focused stillness of a man recalibrating. "You've done this before," he said. "No," Ruth said, "but I've spent a lot of years in a situation where I needed to know where the exits were." He accepted that without comment, which was, she was learning, his version of understanding completely. They worked through the evening by lamplight, and for the first time, the cabin felt like a place where 2 people were operating toward the same end. Declan pulled a rough sketch from inside his coat, not quite a map, more a set of lines that represented the ridge and the approaches to it, and spread it on the table between them. Ruth studied it with the same systematic attention she'd given the crates, tracing the terrain with one flower-scarred finger while he explained what each marking meant. The following morning, she started on the perimeter before he was fully awake. She cut pine stakes from the lumber under the tarp and drove them into the frozen ground along the 2 covered approach lines, low and angled, the kind of thing that wouldn't stop a determined man, but would slow him and make noise doing it. She repositioned the woodpile so that its bulk created a natural choke point on the north side. She found a length of heavy chain in the equipment pile and strung it between 2 trees at shin height across the most direct line from the eastern tree line to the door, then covered it with a thin scatter of snow. Declan came out mid-morning, assessed what she'd done with a slow circuit of the perimeter, and said nothing until he reached the chain. "Trips them," Ruth said, from where she was working on the window frame. "In the dark, they won't see it. If they're running, they won't feel it until it's too late." "And if they come in daylight? Then we have other problems, and this is the least of them." She fitted the pine wedge into the frame and pressed it flush. "But it costs nothing to set, so." Declan crouched and tested the chain's tension with 2 fingers. He stood. He looked out at the tree line for a long moment with the expression of a man measuring distance between himself and something he knew was coming. "How long do you think we have?" Ruth asked. She kept her voice even, kept her hands on the work, but she watched him in her peripheral vision the way she had always watched the people whose moods determined the shape of her day. Declan turned from the tree line and looked at her directly, which he did rarely enough that it meant something when it happened. "You not long," he said. The messenger came 3 days later in the form of a bullet. It came through the east window, the one that worked, the one with the inadequate field of view that Ruth had noted on her first evening and had not yet fully solved, and it took a clean chunk out of the table's edge 6 inches from Declan's hand before embedding itself in the far wall with a sound like a fist hitting wood. They were both on the floor before the echo finished. Ruth had the rifle from beside the door in her hands without conscious decision, her back against the wall beneath the window line, her breathing controlled in the way that fear, when it has nowhere useful to go, sometimes becomes control. Declan was already moving in a low crawl toward the second room, toward the other rifle, toward whatever calculus he was running in his head about angles and positions, and who was standing in the eastern tree line at this hour with enough accuracy to put a round through a window at 200 yards. A warning shot, not a kill shot. Ruth understood the distinction without needing it explained. A man who could thread a bullet through that window from the trees could have put it through Declan's hand rather than beside it if he'd wanted to. The silence that followed was long and complete, and more threatening than the shot had been. "How many?" Ruth asked when Declan reappeared in the doorway of the second room. "One shooter, possibly more in the tree line." "Who?" He didn't answer immediately, and in the silence she heard something shift in the quality of the air between them, the particular atmospheric change of a person deciding how much truth the moment required. His name is Victor Hale. He's a bounty hunter out of Cheyenne. He's been behind me for the better part of 2 years. Ruth kept her eyes on the window. What does he want? What bounty hunters want, payment for delivery. He paused, or proof of the alternative. What did you do? Another silence. Outside, the tree line gave nothing away, just the wind moving through pine branches with complete indifference to the situation below. 3 years ago, I was hired to track a man named Ellison for a cattle consortium out of Denver, Declan said. His voice had the flat, factual quality of a man recounting something he had stopped feeling about. I found him. He had a wife and 2 daughters in a valley outside Laramie, running a small operation, no hands, just family. The consortium wanted him brought in. The charges were fabricated. Ellison had refused to sell land they wanted, so they manufactured a theft claim and hired paper to make it legal. Ruth said nothing. She waited. I took their money and I found their man, and then I let him go. I gave him 2 days' head start and sent a letter to the wrong office about his whereabouts. By the time the consortium understood what I'd done, Ellison was across the territorial line. He paused. They want their money back, with interest. Hale is the interest. Ruth absorbed this. She had spent enough years parsing the difference between a man who did wrong and a man who did wrong and knew it, that the distinction had become for her a reliable instrument. She applied it now and received a clear reading. So he'll keep coming until one of us stops. Another bullet did not come. The tree line remained still, which was in some ways worse. It meant Hale was patient, which meant he was professional, which meant the warning shot had been exactly that, and nothing more. An announcement, a clock being started. Ruth lowered the rifle slightly, but did not set it down. She looked at the hole in the table's edge, at the scatter of wood fiber across the plank floor, at the wall where the bullet had buried itself in the log like a promise. She thought about the chain across the eastern approach, the staked lines, the choke point at the woodpile, the things she had built without fully knowing why she was building them, following some instinct that had now revealed its source. She had known, she realized, not the name, not the details, but the shape of it, the feeling of something patient and inevitable moving through the trees to the place where she lived. She had felt that feeling before. She had grown up with it. The difference was, this time, she had spent 3 days preparing for its arrival.
They came before dawn, which was when Ruth would have come too. She heard them on the chain first, a sharp metallic clatter from the eastern approach, followed by a curse that was quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough. She was already sitting up on the sleeping shelf, boots on, rifle across her knees. She had not slept deeply in 3 days. She had not expected to. She crossed the room in 4 steps and put her hand on Declan's shoulder once, firmly, and he was awake and moving before she pulled it back. "Eastern approach," she said quietly. "At least 2. The chain got 1. He was at the window in seconds, angled to the frame the way she had shown him, using the edge rather than the glass. "I count 3 shapes, maybe 4. 4, Ruth said. She had already moved to the stove. "Hale won't come in the first wave. He'll send the others and watch the outcome." Declan looked at her. "You're sure?" "He's professional. Professionals don't spend themselves first." She pulled the iron pot from the back of the stove. She had set it there 2 days ago, filled with rendered fat and kept at a low heat through every night since, for reasons she had told Declan were about cooking and which had never been about cooking. "Keep them at the door. I need 2 minutes." She didn't wait for his answer. The first man hit the door with his shoulder at the same moment Declan's rifle spoke from the window, a warning shot of their own, high and deliberate, designed not to kill but to scatter, to break the coordinated timing of an entry. It worked well enough. The door held. Ruth heard boots on the steps, a hesitation, voices in low, urgent conference outside. She carried the pot to the door with both hands, the heat of it soaking through the cloth wrapped around her palms, and she positioned herself against the wall beside the frame. "Now," she said. Declan fired twice in rapid succession. Through the wall, Ruth heard the formation outside break apart, feet moving, men separating, the unified pressure of a coordinated breach dissolving into individual panic. Someone shouted a name, someone else shouted an instruction that contradicted it. Ruth opened the door. The nearest man was 3 feet away, turned half sideways, his attention pulled toward the window where Declan's shots had come from. He had time to begin turning back before Ruth swung the pot in a short, controlled arc, and the contents met him in a wave of scalding fat that took him across the arm and chest and face. The sound he made was not a word. He went down and did not get up in any useful way. The second man was on the steps. He had his gun up, but he had been watching his companion fall, and the half-second of human instinct that makes a person look at a catastrophe before responding to it was enough. Ruth dropped the pot, closed the distance in 2 steps, and hit him with her full weight and momentum. Not a punch, not a push, but the complete physical commitment of a body that had been hauling and climbing and carrying for 22 years, and had learned that its mass, properly directed, was not a liability, but a fact of physics. They went off the steps together. He hit the frozen ground with Ruth's weight behind him, and the air left his body in a single percussive grunt. She had his gun hand pinned under her knee before he could recover the breath to use it. She held him there, her hand on his wrist, her weight doing the work, until he stopped moving. When she looked up, Declan was standing at the edge of the tree line 20 yards out, and at his feet was a man in a long gray coat with his hands raised and an expression that had abandoned all previous ambitions. Victor Hale. She knew it without being told, the way you recognize the shape of something you've been bracing for. He was older than she'd imagined, smaller. He looked at her across the frozen ground with the particular expression of a man who had built a career on reading situations correctly and was now confronted with one he had categorically failed to anticipate. She stood up slowly, her breath coming hard in the cold air, and she looked back at him with the same steadiness she had turned on Cord Pruitt in the street of Iron Ridge, what felt like a different lifetime ago. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She never had.
The cold settled back in once the noise was done, the way cold always does at altitude, patient and absolute, indifferent to what had just occurred on the ground beneath it. Declan bound Hale's hands with rope from the woodpile and said something to him in a low voice that Ruth didn't hear and didn't need to. Hale listened with the deflated attention of a man who had run out of options and was now simply waiting to see which reduced set of possibilities he'd be offered. Declan pointed down the mountain. Hale looked at his hands. Declan said something else. Hale started walking. They watched him go until the tree line took him, and then they stood for a moment in the silence of the ridge with the dawn coming up gray and cold over the eastern peaks, painting the snow in colors that had no names in any language Ruth had been taught. She became aware, slowly, that her hands had stopped shaking. She hadn't noticed them shaking until they stopped, which seemed about right. Declan turned from the tree line and walked back to the cabin without a word, and Ruth followed, and they sat at the scarred table with its bullet-notched edge, and Declan made coffee with the focused economy of a man who needed something ordinary to do with his hands. He set a cup in front of her. She wrapped both palms around it and felt the heat work its way in through skin that was still raw from the climb, from the cold, from 3 days of preparation and 1 dawn of consequence. He reached into his coat and set the leather pouch on the table between them. Ruth looked at it. She looked at him. "That's yours," he said. "What I paid your mother. It was your labor that earned it. It was never hers to take." He pushed it a half-inch toward her. "There's enough there to get yourself to Denver. Set up something of your own. You've got the head for it." Ruth didn't touch the pouch.
She looked at it the way she had looked at Cord Pruitt in the street of Iron Ridge, steady, assessing, taking the full measure of what was in front of her before making any decision about it. "And if I stay?" she said. Something in Declan's expression shifted in the way it very occasionally did, not warmth exactly, or not only that, but a kind of careful honesty, the look of a man who had spent so long alone on a mountain that he had forgotten to construct the usual social machinery around what he actually meant. "Then you stay," he said, "as what you are, not what I purchased. That transaction is finished." He looked at his coffee. "You'd have an equal share of what this place produces, equal say in its defense, equal vote on decisions." He paused. "I don't have a better word for it than partner." Ruth thought about Iron Ridge. She thought about the loading dock and the flour sacks, and her mother's voice honed to its daily edge. She thought about the miners outside the general store, and the way she had learned to make herself small inside her own body, even as her body refused to cooperate with the project. She thought about 22 years of being too much in a place that needed her to be less. She looked around the cabin, at the organized stores and the sealed window frame and the chain she had strung between trees in the dark, at the stove she had cleared and lit, at the perimeter she had built from instinct and necessity and the particular strategic intelligence that no one in Iron Ridge had ever thought to ask her about because they had been too busy counting her inches. She thought about the moment on the steps in the pre-dawn dark when she had closed the distance and used her full weight as the weapon it had always been, and felt, for one cold and clarifying second, completely and precisely herself. She picked up the leather pouch. She turned it over once in her hands, feeling its weight, and then she set it down on her side of the table. Not to take it, to claim it. There was a difference, and she understood it now in a way she hadn't the morning she'd left Iron Ridge with a canvas roll and a folding knife and nothing else she was permitted to take. "Partner," she said. Declan nodded once, the way he agreed to things, without ceremony, without excess, with the simple finality of a man whose word was the only currency he'd ever traded in. Outside, the sun finished its climb over the eastern peaks, and the snow on the ridge caught it and held it, and the light that came through the cabin's single window fell across the table between them, across the scarred wood and the bullet notch and the 2 cups of coffee, going slowly cold. And it was not a gentle light or a romantic one. It was just light, clear and high and indifferent and absolutely sufficient. Ruth Callahan drank her coffee and looked out at the mountain that was hers now, and she did not feel too big for it. For the first time in her life, she felt exactly the right size.